Good morning, everyone. This is Steve Handelman of the Center on Media, Crime, and Justice. Welcome to the second day of our 16th annual Guggenheim Symposium on Crime in America. We're sorry for the late start. We're waiting for one of our speakers who hasn't yet shown up in the green room, so we're checking on that. But I think, uh, without further ado, we should start because our time window is so narrow. With our two stalwart speakers that we have now, I think we can start. As you can see from the agenda, um, which I hope you bookmarked, um, we're going to be diving deep into the issues of policing and transforming policing. The overall theme of the conference has been the Biden era, the next 4 years of justice reform. And obviously, we couldn't be talking about the next 4 years of justice reform without taking a really deep look at policing, which is in the news. It's pretty much every day. Lots of ideas circulating about, some of them good, some of them bad, and we're going to be taking a look at, I hope, a good smattering of them during the day today. It's a long day, and I hope you'll find it stimulating and interesting. Um, Let me introduce two of our three panelists. We have Dr. LaShall Brackney, the chief of the police in Charlottesville, Virginia. And we also have David Mahoney, who is the sheriff um, of Dane County, Wisconsin, and is also this year the head of the National Sheriff's Association. And it's important, I thought, that we get chiefs from metropolitan areas of various sizes, and we also look at chiefs from the heartland. Basically, the people in the rural areas are often not talked about in terms of law enforcement and its problems. So we'll be looking specifically at that with Sheriff Mahoney. But what I told both of our speakers in the time that we have is to think about what the toughest thing they've dealt with last year was, and then we can go on from there as a start for our conversation. So, Dr. Brackney, perhaps I should start with you.
So thank you. Thank you for having me. This is day 2, and I'm excited because I saw some of your panelists yesterday, Miriam Krasinski, who is a near and dear friend of mine from Fair and Just Prosecutions, but you also had one of my mentors on, Al Bloomstein, yesterday.
Yes.
We were at Carnegie Mellon together from Pittsburgh, and we're working on reentry back in the early when we were both young. But thank you. So
He's in the audience, by the way, so I think he's hearing you. So
and I
please.
don't know if he even remembers me, but thumbs up, Doc. So hopefully I followed well in your footsteps, and I'll be part of a Carnegie Mellon Journeys discussion today at noon. So we'll get out of there. But so when we want to talk about some of the toughest things or the more challenging things that we've had to think about, and I'm sure Sheriff Mahoney and the other chiefs have dealt with, we are managing a lot of competing priorities right now. If you think about the past 12 months, policing has had to look through a very different lens than it's ever had to look for before. Let's just start with the pandemic and how we now actually police during a time and a space where human contact is a profession that policing has built its reputation on, community policing, being in contact with individuals. That now has almost completely shut down, and you've had to get these new creative ways in which you can engage your communities around the issues of, harm and disorder and violence, feeling safe and being safe. As you're doing that, we then go into a summer that is filled with rallies and demonstrations and marches as the result of the death of George Floyd, in which we've now had a very public lens put on every policing agency and how they've responded. Not only historically, how have they responded to these incidents, but as they were unfolding and continue to unfold as well. And then I would be remiss if I then didn't switch us right into budget season, which we are all facing right now, when there are the calls to defund the police. And that defunding isn't necessarily a call based on dollars and cents, but it's a deconstruction of the fact that there's no longer the same type of trust and legitimacy in the communities. So you're trying to look at that narrative. And then final part of all of that management is we've gone into this legislative agenda, a very robust one here in Virginia and across the nation, when there are the rules and the laws and the ways in which we will now have to serve our communities are going to all come together at this confluence, in Three Rivers, Pittsburgh, we call it the Three Rivers. This is like the quad rivers. Everything is just coming at us at the exact same time. And you still have to do the everyday of answering your police calls, of coming into the communities and still serving in a way that we've never had to serve before, under the level of scrutiny that we've long deserved, but have not necessarily lived up and responded to well in the policing profession.
Let me
So
just pick
hopefully
up
that
on
just
that,
gets there.
on that left. Thank you very much, Chief Brackney. Let me pick up on one last comment you just made. That you said that the scrutiny we've all deserved. Now, you feel that you've been in policing for quite a while. Do you think other people in your middle management and your rank and file feel that the scrutiny they're receiving is deserved, or do they feel that it's unfair, they're being set up as scapegoats?
Well, when you're often far removed from the front lines of whatever the front lines are, right? So the officers are the ones out there on the streets on a daily basis, and then the chiefs or the heads of the agencies are the ones who are implementing policy and also affecting policy. So the ones in the middle, in some ways, are insulated. So they're less likely to see and respond the same way to the type of trauma and scrutiny that a frontline officer or a chief who is out there on the spotlight every single day is going to receive. But is the scrutiny necessary? Absolutely. We have to think about institutions in which we all are serving on that have been built on institutional supremacy, right? On these Western chauvinistic type patriarchal systems. So when you're looking at it through that lens, most people who have sat in these spaces who don't look like myself, or other persons who identify as minorities or of color, who are not necessarily white appearing, they're not used to that type of scrutiny. I'm used to that scrutiny on a daily basis. I see Chief Garcia has joined us. He's used to that scrutiny on a daily basis. And now Sheriff Mahoney, is being the head of the the Sheriff's Association. I didn't mean to demote him. He's going to get even more scrutiny than he might have under normal or traditional circumstances.
Okay, thank you, Chief. Let me move to Chief Garcia. Chief Garcia, welcome to the symposium. Glad to see you. You've got
Thanks for having me.
You've got a very imposing background. So I was starting off with our question about what the toughest thing you faced as an agency head over the last year. So I wonder if you could chime in after Chief Brackney.
Well, to be honest with you, I mean, I will tell you, and I'm sure my colleagues have probably mentioned the same, but dealing with the pandemic, dealing with how certain states would enforce pandemic issues and regulations, obviously the backdrop of George Floyd, the national protests, and then in addition with violent crime rising. Those are things that we've had to all juggle, with in our agencies. And, as we're, it's back, we're getting to a place, I don't want to say we'll ever be back to normal after this pandemic, but we're getting to a place where things are opening up a little bit more and people are being more active. We will always have the social justice issues that we have to deal with to get better as a profession. There's no question about it. But you know what, particularly here in the city of Dallas, we have to do both. We need to ensure that we take the criminal element off of our streets that are plaguing some of our most vulnerable neighborhoods, particularly our communities of color, with violent crime. And we need to ensure that the criminal element is off the street, and at the same time build community trust. That's not easy, but it's absolutely necessary. So I'll speak from my perspective in Dallas, and I'm sure every other major city police chief would say the same thing, that those are really the biggest issues I think that I faced and that we continue to face as we move forward.
You've just been through in Texas a major disaster. Of course, I asked for last year's toughest challenge, but this year has been quite an amazing challenge for law enforcement as well as all emergency forces. Has that put a real strain on your ability to cope and your force's ability to cope?
Well, I'll be honest with you. What's lost in all this is that public safety and our police officers don't know if it's 100 degrees and they don't know if it's 20 below. They have to come to work and they have to serve our communities. And they do that with no fanfare. No one was waiting in this police department, and I'm sure other police departments across the country, for a pat on the back to come into work under those conditions, but they did. Our men and women here and our men and women elsewhere did. And other than a few water mains busting at a couple of our stations, power went out at a couple of our stations, but our men and women went to work every day. I was unbelievably proud of the effort, particularly here in the city of Dallas and our Dallas police officers. And so really, I'd like to tell you that we didn't skip a beat. I'm sure that we did from some perspectives, but ultimately in the end, it was try to do as business as usual out here.
Okay, thank you, Chief. Let me move to Sheriff Mahoney. Same question, but you, of course, are speaking from a totally different perspective, a different space, both as a rural law enforcement officer and representative of the National Sheriff's Association. What was the toughest challenge that you faced last year?
Well, thank you, and it's an honor and pleasure to join the symposium and to join both Chief Brackney and Chief Garcia this morning. Many of the topics that Chief Brackney touched on, particularly the pandemic and the impact that it's had on our 3,080 sheriffs across the country that run jails. When we talk about the need for social distancing and the need for vaccinations, oftentimes that is virtually impossible within a correctional institution. If I use my own with over 1,000 beds, where a year ago I was averaging about 900 individuals under roof each day, where today, because of the pandemic and the need to find solutions in the entire criminal justice system, because as both the chiefs know, the criminal justice system doesn't rely solely on the shoulders of law enforcement. We are often thrown under the bus, so to speak, as being the cause for criminal justice issues, but it's really a partnership between our commissioners who set bail and our DAs who issue charges. And I see a good friend of mine, John Chisholm, is part of your panel for the symposium, as well as our judges and probation and parole, our departments of correction, all play a part in the impact of the criminal justice system. A year ago, as the pandemic broke out within our own institution, our Criminal Justice Council came together to find solutions, to include meeting with the 22 law enforcement agencies within our county to address the need for incarceration, first and foremost, and to find alternatives to incarcerating people in jail. Because not only would it make the institution less safe, in reality, the average stay in jail is about 23 days nationwide. And those individuals are returning back into our communities. And if they didn't come in infected, they may leave infected, and thus spreading this pandemic. As well as working with our DA on charges, working with probation and parole to reduce the number of people incarcerated under roof on probation holds, and then working with our judges to stay sentences to allow people to go back home and appear at some other point in time in the future. This is a trend that we're seeing across the country in jails from the East Coast to the West Coast, that collaboration between criminal justice partners throughout the system.
Let me maybe drill down a little bit on that theme for all of you. We've been talking all yesterday about the different parts of the components of the justice system and how they're working together, or how they're not working together in many cases. But we don't often see law enforcement as a part of a larger team when we talk about public safety or public health in communities. We've seen that now, of course, since the pandemic, how implicitly law enforcement is part of the team that's dealing with the public health crisis around the country. Has that idea of collaboration changed in a way your ideas about policing and how you go about doing your jobs and how your the folks under your command do their jobs. For most people would think, well, I'm a cop. This is my own, job, and that's what I do, and that's what I'm made here for.
Well, I think a lot of these issues are coming to a head this year because of, the pandemic, the fallout from the George Floyd murder in Minneapolis, to the unrest and the call for reforms now in the criminal justice system. And I think that certainly law enforcement leaders, particularly our major city chiefs and our chiefs across the country, our major county sheriffs, as well as our National Sheriffs Association, are really beginning to see the need to be a partner. And I think that really filters down even to the street officer, because as we've seen, certainly in my 41 years in law enforcement, 15 as sheriff, the failures of society fall on the shoulders of law enforcement. We only need to look at mental health as an example. The largest mental health institutions in our country are our county jails. But yet we look for alternatives to locking up individuals with mental health. And the only thing that keeps us from solving that problem is the cost. And there's really a societal cost, I believe, is much more costly than the fiscal cost. If we continue to lock up people in our jails and our prisons with mental illness, we are really doing a disservice, and bordering on cruelty.
Chief Brackley, do you see yourself as part of a team when you might not have before when you got into policing?
So I think the public might see that we're a team. This has long been a collaborative profession, that we could not do this in isolation. You've never been able to police in isolation. That would be an authoritarian state. I think we've always been collaborative. It is now just being highlighted, the need to move across discipline and across agencies and jurisdictions to support each other. The difference is, I think, that the community is seeing is we've had the resources, we've not had the capacity. And those are very different things when you have resources, but no real capacity, even with resources and at hand. As Sheriff Mahoney was saying, is that there are the resources, the money we put towards jails and beds and policing and criminalizing social, ills throughout the entire the nation, but we've not had the capacity to address the issues. And that's a very different approach. And policing has always had to have collaborations. We've always found not-for-profits that were able to help or support us. It didn't just stay in the criminal legal system. We've always had to partner with hospitals to help us with trauma-informed care, or to how do we reduce gun violence in our communities. We've always had to partner with, post-secondary and higher institutions of learning to help us address patterns of, predictive policing. Those models came out of universities. Those crime analysis came out of universities. So the collaborative model has always existed. I think it's now just on the forefront, and people are leveraging resources in a way they've never had to leverage them before. We've always leveraged technology, and collaborated in those fields with the private industry around cameras and computers, et cetera. And one of my first crime analysis models came out of Carnegie Mellon when I worked with a guy named Will Gore on how to do that back in the before these youngsters who are on the phone or the video were long in this profession.
We're condemned to repeat ourselves every 10 years, I guess. Chief Garcia, what's your take? You have to unmute yourself.
I'm on it. I was going at it. That's only taken me the 1,000th time to unmute myself. So, let me just go from a little different angle as we deal with violent crime as an example, and how never has it been more important to be a team. Listen, I mean, there are short-term band-aids to the violent crime problem. Yes, there's making sure that we focus on our high crime areas and violent areas, make sure that we have disruption of criminal enterprises, make sure we have focused deterrence and things of that nature. But one of the things in dynamics is, particularly in my city, Our high crime areas also are coupled with high unemployment. They're also coupled with lower educational scores. They're also coupled with blight. They're coupled, whether it's vacant buildings, abandoned buildings, garbage, graffiti, lack of lighting. What I just mentioned right now all deals to violence in those neighborhoods. And what I just mentioned right now have absolutely nothing to do with the job of a police officer.
Right.
So never has it been more important now to bring everyone on the team to, we need jobs. We need to partner with education, because true success isn't just simply lowering crime rates when our fifth graders in our most violent crime areas are graduating high school. And when those kids graduate in high school, they're getting into college. That's when we start success, but that's not us. That's a partnership. The vacant lots, the graffiti, the lighting, mental health, substance abuse, all those things. And I like to talk about, it's about strengthening our communities, not just simply making them safe, because by strengthening, you're going to make them safe. But strengthening calls in that, hey, we need to be a team with everybody for a long-term solution.
So are police being asked to do too much?
I believe absolutely we're asked to do too much. There's absolutely no question about it. We're asked to do much, particularly in the field, as the sheriff mentioned, with regards to mental illness. That's one area. Dealing with our homeless population is another area. There's two main focuses that I think we're asked to do too much. And there's a reason for that. The reason is, who's out there 24/7? There's really only a few departments that are out 24/7 on the streets doing work. Police officers are one of them. So oftentimes it's the easiest one to say, hey, let's just give it to the officers that are doing it. And we have to stop doing that. We need help with mental illness. We have our officers go.
Thank you. We have some questions. Oh, yes. Sheriff, did you want to chime in on that?
Oh, go ahead.
Well, we've got a couple of questions coming in, but just following up on what Chief Garcia said about police in general being asked too much. I wonder if the same question can apply to police chiefs themselves. Chief Garcia, you just come on from San Jose, where you were a veteran cop for many years. And it strikes me, it strikes us, those of us who've been watching policing over the last 5 or 6 years, that one of the most endangered jobs in policing right now is that of police chief. A lot of chiefs have lost their jobs or resigned or been pushed out. Has police chiefing, or the job of police chief, become a political rather than a law enforcement job now, and it makes it much more difficult for people with your experience and profession to accomplish what you want to?
Well, let me start off by giving an overarching goal as we talk about law enforcement changing. And I say this to academy recruits when they graduate, that when I started in the early 90s, my field training officer told me that, oh, I can't believe you're a police officer today. Things are so much different than they were in the 80s. And I'm fairly certain that when he started in the 80s, that his field training officer told him, I can't believe how law enforcement's evolved. This is so different than it was in the 70s. So I'll be honest with you, I get excited when I hear about how law enforcement is changing. It's always changed. It's always evolved. And this is truly a calling for all of us. Then we rise to the challenges, because our communities need us today more than ever. As that pertains to the police chief role, yes, it's changed. Yes, it's evolved as well. Yes, I'm not quite certain the police chief's job has never not been somewhat political, and you have to balance that. And if you don't want to balance that, then don't put in to get the 4 stars, because you do get pulled in a million different directions, and it goes with what's going. We've had an incredibly busy month here in the city of Dallas, and I will tell you, you get pulled in a lot of directions. And if that is that something that frustrates you, then you need to go find something else to do. I can't be any more blunt about it, because yes, you are going to get pulled in a bunch of different directions to be a police chief, but you got to remember 2 things. You got to remember that you're here for your community, and you're here to lead your men and women in difficult times. And you got to be able to look at yourself in the mirror at the end of the day, every time you go home.
Thank you, Chief.
And just building on what Chief Garcia said, if you think about it, this profession is like any other job. Again, Steelers fan, sorry, Dallas, but Steelers fan, as everyone knows, you fire coaches. You fire the person who runs agencies if you are not getting the results that you want out of your agency. And you're right, they've always been political. They're mayors, city managers, the community. They have input on who is sitting in those spaces, and they're often using that as a political jumpstart to their careers. They're going to make that selection based on what benefits them, their contracts, and all of the other things that go along with it. Now, are we being asked to do too much? What I wouldn't say we're being asked to do too much, but what I am saying is, are they giving these progressive police chiefs who've been doing this work with their heart in the work for as long as they have, are they giving them the time to dismantle and deconstruct systems that they've asked them to then go in and correct? It's a 200-year problem, and you've got your 90 days, like the Biden administration has, to fix what has been occurring over the past either years or decades in this profession. So I think that is where there needs to be a bit more grace.
Sheriff Mahoney?
Well, I fully agree with comments from both the chiefs. I think the chiefs, I've never been a chief, but I think there's a lot of politics. And it falls to the political ambitions of a city's leadership, and now the call for more oversight. Within my own largest city here in Dane County, I have 10 cities within our county, Madison being the largest. Police and Fire Commission now is being taken over by a community oversight committee. The new chief came in from Chicago from a civilian oversight committee. The sheriff is certainly a political position, but there's an advantage to being the sheriff. I work for 750,000 decision makers. And even though I work closely with the county executive and a county board, I have the ability to go to 10 city managers and 22 village presidents and 750,000 residents for decision making.
Okay, so let me move to some of our questions. There's two, starting with you actually, Sheriff Mahoney, two very good questions which I'll sort of merge together. Rebecca Tan from the Washington Post asks if you could spell out some of the similarities or differences in the challenges to police reform that rural counties face as opposed to cities and suburbs. Ayanna Alexander asked what law enforcement officers are doing along with county commissioners and judges to work on a partnership basis with other parts of the community, and what's changed since George Floyd. And really, Rebecca Tan also asked how sheriffs have responded to the surge of activism in their community. So it's a double question, but both looking at the same issues.
Yeah. Well, from a sheriff's perspective, I still think the largest challenge that we've experienced across this country is the pandemic within our correctional institutions. And trying to decrease that population, working with our criminal justice partners, whether it be our DAs, probation and parole, or Department of Corrections on as it relates to probation holds, and our judges, trying to stay sentences or delay sentencing relative to convictions, to allow for social distancing and allow for individuals to remain at home. In my own institution, I've had over 100 individuals. I haven't lost an individual yet. I lost a deputy, and I have 3 that have been out for a year now, unable to return because of COVID. But I still think that's the largest challenge. Now, in the aftermath of George Floyd, what we're seeing is even more interaction with our communities. I'll give you a personal example. The Sunday before Memorial Day last year, I attended one of our largest Black church congregations, working with partners in the communities of color, talking about what projects we had coming up in the coming week. That's when George Floyd occurred. 2 days later, I reached out to many of the people I had been to church with that former Sunday, and the comment was, "We're not talking anymore. We want to see action from law enforcement before we come together to talk." So it was really a restart of the relationship that we'd had for years. And we're still struggling to get up to the same level of interaction that we had prior to George Floyd. And I think it will take some time to do that. As Chief Brackney mentioned, it's not an overnight process. It's not a destination. It's a journey throughout the relationship of the organization to keep those relationships strong, to respond to the needs of the community, which is ever changing. And I think that today in policing, it isn't about talking about what we need to do. It is walking the walk and actually putting it into place. And this is an issue that our sheriffs across the country are not only discussing but doing. Probably in our larger metropolitan sheriff's offices, because we represent sheriffs from the East Coast to the West Coast, from a three-person sheriff's office to the LA County Sheriff's Office. And so it is a diverse group, but I think community engagement, community involvement in solving these needs are probably the second priority that we as sheriffs are dealing with.
Thank you, Sheriff. We have another pair of questions going to roughly the same subject. This is for all of you, really. First, from Joseph Jafari in Spotlight, PA, who points out that among the large number of people arrested for the January 6th Capitol insurrection were a large number of police officers who've been tied to regional white supremacy groups, particularly in Pennsylvania. He asked that what you as chiefs are doing, or what should police organizations be doing to eradicate the problem of police being intertwined with white supremacy. And Francisco Castro, a freelancer, asked very similarly how much attention that your different agencies are devoting right now to the threat of white supremacist groups or right-wing extremists in general, not just in police departments themselves. So Chief Brackney, do you want to take that first, and we can then go to Chief Garcia and then Sheriff Mahoney?
Absolutely. I sit in Charlottesville, Virginia, where the Unite the Right rally started, and started these conversations, particularly about white supremacy and neo-Nazi groups infiltrating police departments. The FBI came out with a finding, I believe last year, long before the insurrection, that white supremacist groups and neo-Nazi groups, extremists, had infiltrated police departments and agencies across the nation. As a minority female, in the South, in Charlottesville, Virginia, I've not only been personally the targeted of these extremist groups where I get hate mail wishing my death, calling me names that most people have not heard of. To believe that it's not coming from within policing and law enforcement would be naive. That helps us. One, we work with our local FBI agencies. Whether we want to admit it or not, and agencies want to admit it or not, you should be checking every one of your social media profiles of your officers, of their family members, etc. These are all public facing. I'm not talking about surveillance or deep state or some other things of that nature. You need to take a proactive response. There are now instruments and assessments that you can give as part of your screening and hiring practices. We have in our policies that you cannot belong to these extremist groups. You can't be part of those groups, and if we find out, we terminate you. That is straight up in the policy that says you cannot be associated with them. And it is calling out these issues. Long before, people used to think that it was like Wisconsin's and Madison and all these other places that had high volumes of militia groups. As back as the 80s, around Bedford and Somerset County, they had some of the highest numbers in Pennsylvania of militia groups and people who really believe that they should be taking to arms to defend the government. So I think we have to do an internal assessment, just like we've had to look at implicit bias and explicit bias. We don't want to forget that those have existed for a very long time in policing, right? We now sugarcoat it and say we're looking for implicit bias so that we don't have to stare explicit biases and hatred in the face. And with more than 900 extremists and hate groups that are being tracked in the United States, and policing are part of the community, you can imagine that there are people who are part of those groups, and it is our collective responsibility to root them out and hold them accountable.
Thank you, Chief. Chief Garcia?
Well, let me just start off by saying that we don't tolerate it. I don't think any police chief in America is going to tolerate that in our ranks. There's no place for it here. Having said that, I can't agree more with Chief Brackney with what she said with regards to, that I think we're all naive if we don't think that we have individuals within our agencies that have those feelings. And it is our duty when we see something, particularly now, for whatever reason, people think they're safe posting whatever they want on social media. And example after example has been made of officers that that's not okay. That you can't hide behind a shroud of either secrecy or free speech or what have you when you do these type of things. That is starting to change. And so we need to ferret them out and we need to get rid of them. It's really that simple. And we need to show that as an example. Ultimately, in the end, we need to strengthen, and one of the things that I think we all need to work on, and we're particularly going to work on it here, is we need to strengthen our pre-employment screening processes. Not solely what Chief Brackney had mentioned about making sure they're not there, but we have individuals that go, we have all our officers go through a battery of psychological tests before they get hired. And then they're on for the next 30 years. And unless there's something extraordinary that happens, there's nothing else that's ever done. And so we need to look as to what common themes, when we do find individuals, there's some common themes that they had in their battery of testing. And we need to use the scientific data that we have available to us to strengthen that process to ensure that those type of individuals don't even get into the door to begin with. And that's a longer conversation, but from a 64,000 foot level, I think that's one of the things that we need to do to ensure that reduces. Are we going to eradicate it? We hire from the human race. And if individuals can hide their emotions as much as they can, it's going to be very difficult to find, which is why it's so important that as soon as someone, lets that out, that we take action.
Thank you, Chief. Sheriff Mahoney, one of the reasons I'm hearing for the prevalence of or the possibility that there are extremists within the ranks is that it's more and more difficult to find recruits. The problems we'll go into this afternoon are problems with staffing and recruiting as well. So do you find that among the sheriffs where it's harder to find the people you want, so you really have to take what you can get?
Well, the key is not taking what you can get. I would rather run short and skyrocket my overtime budget than hire somebody who betrays the character and values of this organization or this profession. As Chief Garcia mentioned on pre-employment, we need to, and I've asked the incoming administration to work with us to help us identify a tool that we can use as part of the incoming psychological evaluation to root out these extremist views and beliefs. Because the key is to make sure they never get in the door in the first place. And as both the chiefs have mentioned, we'd be very naive to think that it doesn't exist within the profession of law enforcement. The ability to hire and the number of candidates coming through the door have dramatically diminished. And sheriff's offices are no different. The key to our leadership nationwide in this profession is to make sure we don't lower our standards, that we don't just allow a position to be filled for the sake of filling a position. This is a calling, as Chief Garcia said. If you're in this for a job, you're in the wrong profession. You are called to serve others before oneself. And it is a great privilege to be allowed to be a law enforcement officer in America, because there are certain rights given to a law enforcement officer that even the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court doesn't have. And because of that, we have an obligation to our citizens across this country to make sure that those with these views, those that betray the trust given to us, never come in the door in the first place. And if they're in our ranks and we identify them, we get that door open and we show them the way out.
Thank you, Sheriff. A question from another one of our reporting fellows, Christina Jedra. Chief Garcia said people are asked to do too much. Police are asked to do too much with mental illness and homelessness. And more cities are starting to send social workers and other crisis intervention teams on nonviolent, non-criminal calls. We'll be talking about this a little bit this afternoon. But the questioner wonders what panelists think of this model, the combined crisis intervention teams. I think they are in existence already in Dallas, but I could be wrong. But maybe Chief Brackney will go to you first.
Thank you for that. So these models have existed for a very long time. You know, Pittsburgh has a model called Resolve, where it's a mobile crisis unit that has been in existence. We've heard a lot about Cahoots, Right Care in Dallas. I mean, there's a lot of models that are really out there. As I stated earlier, though, we often have these quick solutions that we think are going to work, and we've not really done the homework behind the full or given it a full examination. What I mean by that is this. Are we implementing models that are going to get us the desired results? So are these going to be the things that get us to the end? If the outcome is that we have less police interactions and interventions around those persons who are unsheltered, who are experiencing emotional wellness issues, you know, who are disciplinary issues. We haven't even talked about how they've weaponized police in schools, right? That hasn't even been part of the conversation because we've refused to give the type of resources to them, but we also don't build capacity. So I think there is hope there. And I support those models. But then there's also, like in Virginia, the state legislature, the laws say that any emergency custody order or temporary detention order for mental health, the person who enforces that or brings a person into custody is the police officer. So there's no pulling us out of the equation. So it puts us in very difficult spaces where the community says, we don't want you as part of this solution. And the law says you must be part of the solution. And then when we show up, there is that tension that's created between what our duties and responsibilities are and what the community is asking of us in terms of what we do now in terms of policing. So there has to be a way for us to dismantle and reconstruct at the exact same time that we all do this work. But I would also caution that we don't put in models really quickly that we think are going to be these temporary band-aids to these self-inflicted wounds.
Thank you, Chief. Chief Garcia, as well as responding to that question, there's another question here specifically for you, but it also relates to a lot of the issues that other chiefs are working with across the U.S. It's from April Kelly, who talks about Texas Senate Bill 23, which would punish cities that reallocate police department funds to community support services. It's a direct response to the whole defunding movement. So April asked how you think this would affect the future of policing in Texas. Would it help or harm the possibility of repairing or strengthening the strained relationships with communities, especially communities of color? And really, I suppose, even though I don't know if versions of that bill are in other parts of the country right now, but certainly the sentiment is there. So perhaps the other chiefs can respond to that whole that defunding movement, so to speak. And we're running up close to time, so if you can keep your answers as short as you can, thank you.
So for us here, the one thing that we have to remember is that, you know, we've always had to build community ties and continue with community trust. As I mentioned earlier, one of my first comments starting here is that we are going to need to have a full all hands on deck to get out of this on the long haul. And so obviously there's funding that needs to be given to organizations that I had mentioned earlier in different departments to do that. However, what I would also say is in the meantime of getting out of this, I mean, our communities that are truly suffering in violent crime, we are not going to get out of this overnight. It did not happen overnight that those communities look and are what they are now, and it's not going to get over overnight. And in the meantime, we cannot allow our community, particularly our community of color, to be victimized with a murder rate that was soaring. And so we have to balance out the fact that we do need the front end police officer and ensure that our calls for service are answered, ensure that we're suppressing the violence, and at the same time ensuring that the long term is taken care of. I think it's just too overly simplistic to simply say take police funding out to give to these programs when those programs are going to take years to resolve the issues and they're necessary. But in the meantime, we cannot be allowing violence to surge either. So it's overly simplistic to do that. And so I have to look at the bill and read it. And I know we're short on time. We can talk about this for about an hour, if not more. But those are my thoughts.
We'll be going back on those issues throughout the day. That's one of the advantages of having a number of panels where we're looking at the defunding issue, the mental health teams, and that you guys are really setting the tone for us in many ways for what we're going to be discussing for the rest of the day. But Sheriff Mahoney, do you want to talk about how the defunding movement looks like from the point of view of the sheriffs?
Well, most certainly. You know, I fully agree with both the chiefs. As it relates to sheriffs, and again, getting back to jails, I think in my mind, it's more of a refunding of issues or reevaluation of funding. Let's look at who's in jail when 80% of the jail populations nationwide, or roughly those percentages, 80% suffer from drug and alcohol addiction. Are those issues that we should be locking people up in jail and prison for? Or are we better served as a society to fund the programs that prevent people from entering the criminal justice system in the first place and address those addiction issues? And then secondly, we need to reevaluate using our jails as mental health institutions and look for societal benefits to taking that burden off the shoulders of the criminal justice system. As it relates to programs within our patrol units, this is a trend that's picking up within the sheriff's offices. In my own agency, we have 3 shifts a day. We have master's level social workers in our patrol bureau dedicated exclusively to family and mental health related issues. And within the jail, social workers dedicated to reentry for individuals with mental illness to make sure that when they're leaving the institution, they're connected to their caseworkers. They have the medication they need in that gap in between their reintroduction to a caseworker to make sure that they're not coming through that revolving door. These are priorities that society needs to make and take that burden off the shoulders of law enforcement and reevaluate funding, not defunding, but reevaluate funding.
Thank you, Sheriff. So we have something like 5 minutes left, and I want to go around to each of you since we are talking to a lot of our audience who are journalists and covering these issues. I wonder if each of you can say what you think journalists should know or should be covering when it comes to policing and police chiefs. What are they doing now that they, or are they not doing now that they should be doing in terms of coverage? What do we need to know? If you could maybe answer in about 30 seconds each, if you could, that would be great. Thank you. Maybe Sheriff Chief Brackney, to you first.
Quick 30-second soundbite, right? Because that's what they operate in. I think the thing that they should be doing is hitting pause. That, you know, they drive their media by their deadlines, and those deadlines shape and then inform what that story looks like without any real thought about the damage that it can do either to the readers or to the persons who are the target of those. If they're operating on deadlines, don't use that deadline is a way in which to then fashion a story that gets you what you believe is your desired outcome. Journalism is about actual, authentic reporting and digging deep into an issue. Yes, there are some things that need to be immediately reported, but I would also ask that they ask for the same type of pause and de-escalation that they want from us, from the media as well.
Thank you, Chief. Chief Garcia?
Well, I'll say to that point, it takes both of us. I'll say, I know many chiefs as well that may be a little standoffish with media, that may not want to get in front of issues and those of that nature. We know in this work that if we don't connect dots for our media, which is extremely important to the job to do, they're going to connect them for us. So we need to be open. We need to be transparent. We need to get out there. So the onus is on us as well. It's not simply on media. But what I will say is that when the media has a willing chief, someone who's willing to be transparent, someone who's willing to work with them to give us the chance and the opportunity to at least listen and then be fair when they write their stories, when we're willing. But it's a two-way street. They hopefully could listen to us. We as police chiefs need to not hide behind things and try to get in front of things as much as possible as well.
Sheriff, you get the last word.
It's a partnership. My responsibility is transparency and open dialogue with the community on what's occurring within law enforcement. And it's my role to do that is to work with our journalists to make sure that the questions they have get answered and keep our community informed. One of my biggest frustrations is the story is strictly the press release that comes out of my PIO's office. Help me do the research or ask the tough questions. We'll answer them. That's our responsibility.
Thank you all. You've actually amazingly well disciplined. You've each stayed within 30 seconds. I want to thank you for taking the time out for what I know are busy days for each of you to talk with us and meet with us. It's much appreciated. And if you can stay with us for the rest of the day or for some of our other panels, you're most welcome. But thank you very much and good luck to you, all three of you. And we'll take
Thank
a 10
you.
minute.
Thank you.
We will take a short 10-minute break and then come back at 10:10 our time.
Be well. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief.